If you ever find yourself thinking that your workplace Christmas party was a pit of a disaster, spare a thought for the French court in the late 14th century. Because while Karen from accounts knocking over the punch bowl is mildly inconvenient, it really doesn't compare to your king setting himself and several of his closest friends on fire. To understand how we get there, we need to meet the star of this impending catastrophe, Charles VI of France, a man who reigned for over 4 decades and was, let's be charitable, not known for his consistent grip on reality. History, in its usual tactful way, has preserved his nickname as Charles the Mad, which should tell you a fair amount about the atmosphere at the royal court. Charles didn't start off entirely unhinged. Born in 1368, he became king at the tender age of 11, and for a while seemed perfectly capable of doing the usual king things, wearing crowns, declaring wars, collecting taxes, and so on. But by his mid-20s, Charles began having what can only be described as episodes. These ranged from forgetting who he was, to forgetting who anyone else was, to, on one memorable occasion, fleeing through the corridors of his palace, insisting he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. Now, being made of glass is a tricky belief to hold if you're the King of France, but being Charles meant you could still demand elaborate entertainment while in such a state. And entertainments there were: banquets, tournaments, pageants, and, as we'll soon see, masquerades. The French court at this time was in the mood for grandeur. The 100 Years' War was limping along in the background, but inside the palace it was all velvet draperies, peacock feasts, and complicated dances that involved more bowing than actual moving. The king's mental health might have been erratic, but his taste for spectacle was unwavering. Unfortunately, a taste for spectacle in 1393 could easily get out of hand. You didn't have fireworks, you didn't have pyrotechnics. What you had was fire, the real sort. And the real sort, when combined with medieval fabrics and absolutely no concept of modern safety standards, tended to end in disaster. Charles's court, however, was not a place for cautious thinking. It was a place where ideas were applauded before they were evaluated, and nobody wanted to be the one to tell the king that perhaps dressing up as a flammable woodland creature wasn't the best plan. After all, you tried telling a monarch nicknamed the Mad that his party costume might be a hazard. Thus, with his mind swinging between lucidity and delusion, Charles presided over a kingdom full of courtiers who laughed when he laughed, danced when he danced, and, in one infamous case, burned when he burned. The stage was set, quite literally, for a ball that would go down in history, and not for the reasons anyone intended. The trouble began, as it often does in royal circles, with a wedding. Not even the king's wedding, mind you. That might have inspired little more care. But the third marriage of one of Queen Isabeau's ladies-in-waiting. In most households, the third marriage of a friend of your wife might merit a polite gift and perhaps a bottle of something bubbly. In 14th century France, however, it meant a celebration so lavish you'd think it was the Treaty of Troyes all over again. The French court adored weddings. They were the social glue that bound noble families together, and, more importantly, a marvelous excuse to eat, drink, and display the kind of wealth that could fund a small army. A marriage within the Queen's inner circle wasn't just a personal affair, it was a matter of prestige, which meant naturally that the festivities needed to be spectacular enough to make the Venetian ambassadors write home about it in gushing tones. And so it was decided the party would take place at the Hôtel Saint-Paul, the king's preferred Parisian residence. This was no modest townhouse. It was a sprawling complex of halls, chambers, and gardens, a place where the ceilings were high enough to lose your voice shouting across, and the tapestries depicted scenes so intricate you could spend an entire feast trying to work out which knight was stabbing which Saracen. Now, the Queen's lady-in-waiting in question has been largely forgotten by history, which is a shame. She was, after all, the accidental cause of one of the most memorable disasters of the age. But at the time, she must have been the toast of the court, the recipient of lavish gifts, whispered congratulations, and probably a few envious side eyes from those whose own third marriages had passed without such fanfare. In the spirit of excess, the entertainment committee, which in this case consisted of the king and whoever happened to be standing near him when the idea struck, settled on something original. They would have a masquerade, and not just any masquerade, a wild one, a performance with costumes, music, and a faint whiff of danger, just enough to make the guests' hearts race, but not, you understand, in a way that anyone thought might end in actual death. The theme? Wild men, mysterious, hairy, untamed figures from the edge of civilization. It was medieval performance art meets woodland mythology, with a dash of, wouldn't it be funny if, thrown in. Perfectly normal for 1393. The fact that the entire plan hinged on the king himself participating in a combustible outfit seems to have been considered a charming quirk rather than a flaw. So the invitations went out, the palace was prepared, the kitchens began working overtime, and the court's most powerful figures gathered in anticipation of an evening that would, one way or another, be remembered for centuries. The guests were expecting an evening of elegance, amusement, and perhaps a little scandal. What they got was all that, and rather more heat than they bargained for. The wild man figure was a powerful and enduring image in medieval Europe, a symbol that appeared across literature, pageantry, art, and festival traditions. In its simplest form, the wild man was a figure of the untamed, covered in hair, living outside the bounds of civilization, and representing the dangerous allure of the wilderness. His world was the forest, his existence outside the laws of church and kingdom. The origins of this figure were complex. Early depictions can be traced back to the 12th and 13th centuries, where they appeared in manuscripts, wood carvings, and even the margins of illuminated Bibles. The wild man was often shown wielding a club, his body obscured by hair or leaves. He was a creation partly born from European folklore and partly from classical influences, blending medieval fears of the untamed with earlier Greco-Roman satyrs and fauns. In stories, he was sometimes a brute to be hunted, sometimes a wise hermit with secret knowledge. The symbolism was adaptable, which is perhaps why it lasted for centuries. For medieval audiences, the wild man embodied more than just savagery. He was a warning, an emblem of the chaos and moral corruption that could creep in if the order of the realm collapsed. Yet he also represented strength, raw vitality, and a freedom that civilization could never offer. These contradictions made him a compelling figure for courtly entertainment, where allegory was prized, and every costume or emblem carried layers of meaning. By the 14th century, wild men had become a common motif in courtly tournaments, festivals, and processions. They were sometimes portrayed in mummeries and dances, where performers would wear suits of flax, moss, or hemp to mimic the appearance of a man entirely covered in hair. The effect was striking, especially when combined with masks, horns, or foliage headdresses. In these contexts, the wild man could be a comical character, but he could also be dangerous, particularly when the performances involved fire, as the flammable materials used for the costumes would later prove disastrous. The tradition's endurance was also linked to medieval fascination with the boundaries between the known and the unknown. Wild men stood at the edge of maps, much like mythical beasts in cartography, marking the limits of civilization. They were associated with untamed landscapes, deep forests, rugged mountains, and faraway islands. Stories told of knights who ventured into such places encountering wild men who tested their courage or offered prophetic warnings. These tales mirrored a cultural truth. Medieval Europe lived with a constant tension between the cultivated world and the wilderness beyond. For the Valois court, and for King Charles VI in particular, the wild man imagery had an added layer of meaning. By the late 14th century, the king's bouts of mental illness had already shaped how his subjects perceived him. Pageantry at court was often a way to display unity, vitality, and control, but it could also reveal the tensions and risks beneath the surface. When Charles and his companions dressed as wild men, they were not just entertaining, they were also stepping into a role that carried allegorical weight. The wild man was a figure who straddled the line between the civilized and the chaotic, much as the king himself was seen to do in moments of instability. There was also precedent for royalty and nobles to embrace this theme in pageantry. Across courts in Burgundy, Bohemia, and the German principalities, wild men appeared in marriage celebrations, tournaments, and feast day entertainments. Sometimes the imagery celebrated martial prowess, wild men as fierce protectors of the realm. Other times, it hinted at fertility and renewal, particularly in midwinter festivals where the defeat or taming of the wild man symbolized the return of order with the coming of spring. The choice of costume for the fateful Bal des Arts was therefore not a random indulgence in fancy dress. It was steeped in cultural tradition and symbolic significance. The king and his companions were tapping into a widely recognized motif, one that was both thrilling and unsettling to the courtly audience. In a hall illuminated by torchlight, the sight of these half-human, half-bestial figures dancing would have been electrifying. For those present, the performance likely evoked both amusement and unease, as the line between festive spectacle and dangerous reality blurred. It is important to understand that medieval audiences were highly literate in the language of symbols. They would have recognized the costumes instantly and understood the possible meanings being played with. The wild man could be seen as a threat to be subdued, a playful guest at the feast, or even an embodiment of the king's own vitality. But when fire was added to the scene, whether for lighting, atmosphere, or dramatic effect, it turned an already charged performance into a lethal risk. This duality, danger and delight, order and chaos, was at the heart of the wild man tradition. It was precisely this tension that made the motif so appealing for courtly spectacle, and also why it proved so tragically appropriate for an event that would end in disaster. The wild men costumes prepared for the ball were, at first glance, the height of medieval spectacle. Crafted to astonish, they combined texture, movement, and an almost primal visual menace. Yet, in their very making, these outfits concealed a terrible flaw. They were essentially made of tinder. Each costume began with a foundation of tight-fitting linen, the common undergarment fabric of the time. Linen was widely used across Europe for clothing layers worn next to the skin because it was soft, strong, and relatively easy to clean. However, linen fibers, once dry, could ignite if exposed to open flame for long enough. Alone, this was a risk, but what came next made matters exponentially worse. Over the linen base, the makers attached strips of frayed hemp, creating the illusion of shaggy hair or moss to evoke the wild man's untamed look. Hemp rope was cheap and plentiful in 14th century France, often used in shipping, agriculture, and construction. Frayed into threads, it had a loose, fibrous structure that caught on everything and, critically, could catch fire with alarming speed. Finally, the strips of hemp were soaked in pitch. Pitch, a dark, sticky resin derived from wood tar, served a dual purpose. It made the fibers stiff and wild-looking, and it ensured the costume would hold its shape during the festivities. In medieval craftsmanship, pitch was used for waterproofing boats, sealing barrels, and binding rope. Its use here was purely aesthetic. Unfortunately, pitch was highly flammable, and once lit, it burned hot and fast, producing thick, choking smoke. The result was a visual triumph, but a fire hazard of the deadliest kind. In the 14th century, fire safety was not a discipline in the way we think of it today. In fact, the concept barely existed outside of basic common-sense precautions. Candles and oil lamps were the primary sources of indoor lighting, and open hearths burned constantly in homes and halls. The risk of accidental fire was omnipresent, but most measures taken were reactive, such as keeping buckets of water or sand nearby, rather than preventing ignition in the first place. Flammable clothing was especially dangerous in crowded, enclosed spaces. Yet medieval fashion often embraced materials like wool, linen, silk, and fur, all of which had varying degrees of susceptibility to flame. Wool, while naturally more resistant, was heavy and ill-suited to the wild man aesthetic the king desired. Linen and hemp, being lighter and more workable, were chosen for effect, with no thought given to their ignition point. It is important to remember that illumination for court events in this period came entirely from naked flames. Torches lined the walls, candles sat in great candelabra, and braziers glowed to keep winter chill at bay. The medieval court was a world in which people moved constantly through pools of flickering firelight, their silks and satins glinting as shadows danced across the room. Every guest at the ball that night would have been accustomed to weaving between open flames. And yet, familiarity breeds carelessness. No one saw the danger of combining pitch-soaked hemp with an environment full of exposed fire. To the artisans who prepared the costumes, the focus was on impact, on creating a living embodiment of myth. The wild men were supposed to shock and amuse, a reminder of the untamed forces beyond the castle walls. And, in the king's mind, this theatrical illusion would be the centerpiece of the evening. In modern hindsight, the choice of materials feels almost unthinkable. Hemp frays behave like a bundle of matchsticks. Pitch is essentially a primitive accelerant. When bound together over a human body, the combination forms a sort of wearable pyre. In a time when people regularly witnessed accidental fires devour entire villages in minutes, such oversight seems reckless. But medieval court life was often a strange balance of splendor and danger. To the king and his companions, the spectacle mattered more than any hypothetical risk. This was, after all, a time when jousting tournaments routinely resulted in fatal injuries, when hunts claimed noble lives, and when military pageantry often blurred into real combat. The thrill of risk was part of aristocratic culture. Still, the wild man costumes represented a very particular hazard. They were flammable not just in part, but in every component. The linen clung close to the skin. The hemp created a loose, airy layer perfect for catching flame, and the pitch ensured that the costume would spread rapidly and stick to the wearer. No record survives of whether the costumers voiced any concern during their making. If they did, it was ignored, or perhaps they simply assumed that the king's presence meant the designs were beyond question. In medieval court hierarchy, to challenge the monarch's vision was dangerous in itself. If the king wanted pitch there would be. This lack of foresight was not unusual. In 14th century Europe, fire-related disasters at public events were more common than we might assume. Crowded feasts, torchlit processions, and festivals with pyrotechnic displays occasionally ended in tragedy. Yet, memory of these events rarely translated into lasting safety reforms. After all, in an age without rapid communication or centralized regulation, each incident was treated as an isolated misfortune rather than a systemic warning. The flammability of the wild man costumes was therefore not a unique oversight. It was part of a wider medieval pattern in which aesthetics and symbolism almost always outweighed safety. When the night of the ball arrived, the costumes must have appeared a triumph of visual theater. In the shifting light, the dark pitch fibers would have caught strange highlights, giving the impression of something not quite human, a silhouette both menacing and fascinating. The king, hidden within one of these suits, would have appeared a living embodiment of the mythical wild man, a ruler who could embody even the forces of chaos for the sake of his court's entertainment. The Hôtel Saint-Paul was no ordinary residence. In the late 14th century, it stood as one of the crown jewels of Paris, a sprawling complex on the right bank of the Seine, specifically commissioned to suit the tastes of King Charles V. Though by the time of the tragic masquerade, the crown had shifted to his son, Charles VI, the palace retained much of the elder king's meticulous design, a blend of security, luxury, and opulence that would impress the highest-born guests. The structure was not a single building, but a series of interconnected wings and courtyards, each devoted to different functions. There were private royal apartments, reception halls, banquet rooms, chapels, and enclosed gardens. The architecture reflected the best of late Gothic style. Pointed arches, tall narrow windows, and steeply pitched roofs covered in glazed tiles. From the outside, the Hôtel Saint-Paul presented a dignified, if somewhat austere, silhouette. Inside, however, was a world of color, texture, and craftsmanship that spoke of royal prestige. The main reception wing was designed for grandeur. Guests entered through an arched gateway into a paved courtyard before passing under heavy oak doors reinforced with wrought iron. The Great Hall, often used for feasts and celebrations, featured a vaulted timber ceiling, supported by carved beams in brightly painted corbels. This hall connected to smaller salons where intimate gatherings could take place, perfect for the sort of masked ball planned for that fateful evening. Beyond the halls lay the private chambers of the king and queen, accessible only through guarded passages. These royal apartments were richly furnished with imported carpets, embroidered wall hangings, and large canopied beds. Heating was provided by elaborate fireplaces, their mantels carved with heraldic symbols and biblical scenes. Every detail was meant to remind visitors of the monarchy's wealth and divine right to rule. Outside, walled gardens offered a measure of tranquility. There were lawns edged with box hedges, medicinal herb beds, and small ornamental fountains. In summer months, these spaces were alive with the scent of lavender, thyme, and roses. On this winter's night, however, the gardens lay dormant, blanketed in frost. When word spread that a masquerade was to be held at the Hôtel Saint-Paul, preparations began days in advance. Servants bustled through the halls, carrying armfuls of candles, rushed torches, and polished brass sconces to ensure the rooms glowed with warm light. Tapestries were rehung to cover drafty stone walls, their imagery depicting scenes from Arthurian legend and the victories of past French kings. The ball was to take place in one of the grand salons, not the great hall itself, but a richly paneled room with a polished stone floor, ideal for dancing. Along the walls stood benches draped with velvet for guests to rest between dances. Above, candlelight reflected off gilded ceiling bosses, and the occasional polished metal shield hung as a decorative piece. Musicians were stationed on a raised platform at the far end, their instruments tuned and ready, lutes, shawms, and small drums that would set the rhythm for the evening's performances. Servants circulated with silver trays, bearing sweetmeats, spiced wine, and mulled cider, ready to keep guests refreshed. The Hôtel Saint-Paul was accustomed to hosting celebrations, but this ball carried a special sense of theatricality. It was to be not just a courtly dance, but an event of spectacle and surprise. The king himself planned to participate in an elaborate entrance, the now infamous Wild Men performance, which meant even more care was taken with staging. Every flicker of candlelight, every drape of fabric was chosen to heighten the visual effect. The glow from hundreds of candles softened the hard lines of the stone walls, creating a golden haze in which jewels and embroidery sparkled. Perfumed rushes had been scattered across the floor to mask any lingering winter damp and to release a pleasant aroma when stepped upon. In the corridors leading to the salon, the hum of conversation was already building. Nobles in glittering costumes adjusted their masks, servants hurried with last-minute errands, and guards in ceremonial attire kept a discreet but watchful presence. In an upper chamber, the wild men, the king and his companions, made their final preparations, donning their pitch-soaked hemp costumes. At this point, no one suspected the danger. It was a court accustomed to pageantry, and this was simply another display of the monarchy's creativity. If anyone had paused to consider the hazards, the open flames, the flammable costumes, the crowded hall, the thought did not interrupt the evening's momentum. Fire was a constant in medieval life, but it was also a controlled ritual part of court entertainment. Torches, candelabras, and braziers were as much a part of the visual experience as music and dance. The architecture of the Hôtel Saint-Paul was not designed with fire safety in mind. Timber beams, draperies, and dried rushes could catch alight quickly, and escape routes were often narrow staircases or locked side doors reserved for the royal family. In this case, those very design features that made the palace intimate and exclusive would prove to be deadly constraints once disaster struck. As guests gathered, the air grew warmer, charged with anticipation. Outside, the winter wind rattled against the shutters. Inside, the Hotel St. Paul glowed with light, music, and the confidence of a court that believed itself untouchable. Within minutes, that confidence would be shattered. If there is one rule that applies to medieval costume balls, it's this: don't bring fire to a room full of highly flammable nobles dressed as kindling. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Louis, Duc d'Orléans, had never been much of a rules man. Louis was the younger brother of King Charles VI, which sounds prestigious until you realize it meant he had all the influence of a prince, but none of the actual responsibility. His personality could be politely described as flamboyant, and less politely described as an aristocratic chaos gremlin. He was clever, ambitious, and blessed with a kind of charm that made people forgive him for things they really shouldn't have. Politically, Louis had his eyes everywhere. He fancied himself the unofficial co-ruler of France, especially during Charles's increasingly frequent episodes of mental instability. But what he really excelled at was spending money, starting feuds, and throwing parties that made the Vatican shake its head in disapproval. His relationship with Charles was complicated. On good days, they were affectionate brothers. On bad days, Louis was subtly maneuvering himself closer to the throne, all while pretending he was just there to lend a supportive ear. The Hotel St. Paul that night was already buzzing with a strange mix of excitement and slight anxiety. The king and 5 of his friends were dressed as wild men, a delightful medieval fancy dress concept that involved being sewn into costumes of linen, slathered in pitch, and stuck all over with frayed hemp fibers. From a safe distance, the effect was impressive. A convincing ensemble of hairy, primitive forest creatures, ready to frolic for the amusement of the court. Up close, however, they looked less like mythical wild men and more like a tragic candle factory accident waiting to happen. The court, recognizing this, had wisely decreed no open flames anywhere near the dancers. The music played, the wild men jigged about in their chains, the guests laughed. For once, everything was going according to plan. Then came the sound that would change the course of the evening, the heavy wooden doors of the great hall swinging open. In strode Louis, grinning like a man who knew exactly how fabulous he looked. And he did, richly dressed, impeccably groomed, and carrying, of all things, a lit torch. Now, there are 2 theories about why Louis brought that torch. The charitable version is that he had been delayed and simply hadn't heard the no naked flames rule. The less charitable version is that he absolutely had heard it and thought it was an amusing overreaction. The medieval equivalent of ignoring the flammable sign on a petrol can because you're sure nothing bad will happen. Louis, as we know, was not famous for erring on the side of caution. He swept into the hall, waving the torch theatrically, as though he were some kind of human chandelier. The guests gasped, not because they feared disaster, not yet, but because Louis knew how to make an entrance. He stepped closer to the dancers, calling out some witty remark about how the wild man looked ready to roast marshmallows. That's when it happened. One of the wild men, possibly emboldened by the audience's laughter, or perhaps just trying to show off, twirled a little too near to Louis's blazing torch. The flame caught the hemp fibers instantly. With a noise like dry kindling catching in a hearth, the dancer went up in a burst of fire. For a fraction of a second, everyone froze. The brain takes a moment to process the sight of a nobleman turning into a medieval firework. Then came the screaming. The burning dancer, understandably panicked, began running around the hall in a desperate attempt to put himself out, which was a bit like trying to extinguish a bonfire by carrying it briskly from one part of the garden to another. Each time he brushed against another wild man, their costume caught as well. The pitch and hemp made for an alarmingly effective accelerant. Within seconds, the spectacle had shifted from a merry court dance to a scene from the world's worst safety demonstration. While chaos erupted, one person kept her head. The 14-year-old Duchess of Berry spotted the king, still in full flammable wild man costume, and without hesitation dragged him under her enormous skirts. This is not an act generally recommended in firefighting manuals, but in this case, it worked. Her heavy layers of fabric shielded him from the flames and saved his life. The other dancers were not so fortunate. One, thinking quickly, hurled himself into a barrel of water and managed to survive. The Comte Johnny was not so lucky. He burned to death almost instantly. Yvain de Foix and Marie de Poitiers lingered for 2 agonizing days before succumbing to their injuries. Huguet de Guisset, the courtier blamed for suggesting the wild man stunt in the first place, died the day after them. Louis, for his part, seems to have avoided physical harm, though one imagines his social calendar may have been rather quiet for a while after that. The incident became known as the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men, and quickly took on the quality of a cautionary tale. It was told in hushed, scandalized tones at courts across Europe. Even in an age when jousts occasionally ended with someone's head being accidentally removed, this was considered an especially reckless royal entertainment. For Louis, it was another episode in a career full of episodes. One more reason his political opponents could accuse him of being dangerous, irresponsible, and entirely too fond of theatrics. For Charles VI, it was a rare lucky escape in a reign otherwise defined by bad fortune and worse mental health. And for the rest of the court, it was a reminder that sometimes the difference between a successful costume party and a historical tragedy is just one flamboyant man with a torch. If the evening had been odd before, it now took a sharp left turn into utter catastrophe. According to one horrified observer, the fire began with a flash, a roar, and the smell of burning hair. Although, to be fair, in a 14th century court, burning hair wasn't always an unusual smell. The moment the torch kissed the costume, the result was instantaneous. The pitch-soaked linen didn't so much catch fire as explode into enthusiasm for the idea. 1 second the Duc d'Orléans was grinning and waving his torch about like a man who'd had one too many goblets of wine. The next, one of the wild men was a human firework. For a fraction of a second, the court seemed frozen. all wide eyes and dropped goblets, as if everyone was wondering, is this part of the act? After all, Charles VI was famous for putting on a show. But then came the screaming, and the smell, and the sight of a flaming nobleman windmilling around the hall like a torch relay gone to hell. For a fraction of a second, the court seemed frozen, all wide eyes and dropped goblets, as if everyone was wondering, is this part of the act? After all, Charles VI was famous for putting on a show. But then came the screaming, and the smell, and the sight of a flaming nobleman windmilling around the hall like a torch relay gone to hell. Minute 1, the first man alight, Yvan de Foix, unlucky enough to be on the side nearest Louis, flailed into his neighbor, because the dancers were chained together for dramatic effect. The flames transferred like a gossip in a small village, fast, indiscriminate, and unstoppable. Within seconds, 3 more men were ablaze. Minute 2. Imagine a slow-motion domino effect, except the dominoes are screaming and on fire. The costumes, soaked in pitch and adorned with frayed hemp, behaved exactly like the safety manuals of the era had warned, if safety manuals had existed. Chronicler Michel Pintoin later remarked that the heat was so sudden and fierce that the air seemed to crackle. Meanwhile, the orchestra stopped mid-note. Nothing kills a medieval dance tune quite like a man shrieking, "Help, I'm on fire," over the beat of the tambour. Minute 3. Guests tripped over benches, goblets, and each other. Servants dropped trays. The air filled with smoke, sparks, and the sort of chaos you normally only get when someone lets loose a farm animal indoors. The Queen screamed for water. Someone else screamed for wine. Someone else just screamed. Minute 4. In the confusion, the king, also in flammable fancy dress, very nearly joined the list of casualties. Enter the 14-year-old Duchess of Berry, who apparently had decided that the best fire blanket available was her own skirts. She grabbed Charles, shoved him under the folds of her gown, and refused to move. Witnesses claimed she sat there, completely calm, while sparks landed on the hem. It's possible she was simply too young to fully register that she was protecting the monarch from dying in what could only be described as the world's most idiotic accident. One man, quick-thinking and unwilling to die at a party, hurled himself into a wine barrel, which, while unorthodox, did the job. The others weren't so lucky. The pitch burned hot, fast, and without mercy. Flames leapt higher as nobles, their costumes melting to their skin, stumbled toward the door. According to Jean Froissart, many there thought the devil himself had come among them, which, in fairness, was exactly what it looked like. By now the hall was a choking haze of smoke. The fire was out, but the damage had been done. The Comte de Joigny lay dead where he fell. Yvan de Foix and Aimé Pottier would die within days. Hugues de Guisset, the man most blamed for inventing the wild man idea in the first place, lingered just enough to realize history would never let him live it down. The party ended not with a polite bow or a last dance, but with a stinking, blackened silence, and the name it earned, the Bal Visacdon, the Ball of the Burning Men, ensured nobody would ever again hear the words, "Let's do costumes," without first checking the fire exits. When the firestorm erupted inside the Hôtel Saint-Paul's Grand Hall, the scene was already chaos. Guests screamed, musicians abandoned their instruments, and the floor became a tangle of bodies and burning debris. In the midst of this terror stood one of the most remarkable figures of the evening, a 14-year-old girl whose courage would be remembered in chronicles for centuries, Jeanne, Duchesse de Berry. Jeanne was not simply a passive spectator. Positioned near the central dance area, she had a clear view of the moment the flames leapt from one wild man costume to another. The pitch-soaked hemp on the dancers' limbs transformed them into living torches in seconds. In the confusion, she saw her uncle, King Charles VI, engulfed in a frenzy of danger. His flammable costume was catching fire from the men already ablaze around him. There was no pause for deliberation. In that split second, Jeanne recognized the stakes. Without immediate intervention, the king could perish before anyone could beat back the flames. Contemporary chronicles, particularly those of Jean-François and Michel Pintois, describe her response as an act of astonishing presence of mind. She reportedly grabbed the voluminous skirts of her heavy court gown and threw them over the king's upper body, pressing herself against him to cut off the oxygen feeding the fire. This was no minor gesture. The fabrics worn by the nobility at that time were themselves far from fireproof. Silk, velvet, and wool could smolder or catch alight if exposed too long to heat. Her act placed her directly in harm's way, risking her own clothing and life to smother the flames. It is important to understand just how perilous this action was in a 14th century context. There were no fire blankets, no ready access to buckets of water inside the hole. Medieval fire safety was primitive at best. Once a garment caught, it could burn completely in less than a minute. Jeanne's proximity to the burning wild men made her vulnerable to stray sparks or direct ignition. In saving the king, she risked being pulled into the same chain of disaster. By covering Charles VI with her skirts, she created a temporary barrier that slowed the spread of flames onto his torso and face. This gave nearby attendants just enough time to push away the burning dancers and douse the king's legs with wine or ale from the banquet tables, a crude but sometimes effective emergency measure. The combination of her shielding and the frantic assistance of a few quick-thinking guests ensured the king escaped with little more than singed hair and scorched garments. Chroniclers recorded her bravery with uncharacteristic warmth for a young noblewoman. François, in particular, emphasized her composure, noting that she acted without fear, moved by loyalty and love of kin. Pintois' account dwelled on the immediacy of her action, contrasting her decisiveness with the stunned inaction of many older and more experienced courtiers. Jeanne, Duchesse de Berry, was already a figure of political significance due to her family ties, but the incident at the Bal des Ardents elevated her to a symbolic role, the young savior of the king. In later years, she would navigate the turbulent politics of the French court during Charles VI's recurrent bouts of mental illness and the ongoing 100 Years' War. Although the dramatic rescue remained her most famous moment, it also seems to have strengthened her reputation as a woman of courage and intelligence. In a period when royal women were often expected to be decorative rather than decisive, her actions stood out as an example of decisive intervention in a male-dominated sphere. What makes Jeanne's act so compelling is not just its political consequence, but its human immediacy. Faced with a split-second choice between self-preservation and risking her life for another, she chose the latter. The fact that she was a teenager and that the person she saved was the king whose reign defined her era only deepened the symbolic power of the moment. Her intervention did not end the tragedy of the Baile des Daws. 4 of the wild men dancers still perished from their burns, and the memory of the disaster continued to haunt the French court. But without Jean's quick thinking, the fire might also have claimed the life of the king himself, plunging France into an even deeper crisis. The first screams were swallowed by the roar of the flames. Heat ripped through the air, twisting it, distorting the glittering hall into a hellish blur. Those closest to the burning dancers recoiled in terror, skirts catching underfoot, sleeves snagging on chairs, but there was no time to think, only to flee. The king, still trapped inside his costume, became a beacon of panic as the fire devoured his companions, the smell of burning pitch and hair choking the air. One man, half blind from the smoke, staggered and fell to his knees, rolling desperately on the floor. But the frayed hemp clung to the fire like a lover that would not let go. The pitch made the flames bloom hotter, faster, refusing to be smothered. Servants threw wine, tore tablecloths from the trestles to wrap around the burning men, but the liquid hissed and steamed uselessly. Someone shouted for water, and a half-drunk onlooker remembered the great barrel by the corner. In a moment of instinct, one of the wild men broke from the writhing knot of agony and hurled himself headlong into it. Steam roared from the cask as the water boiled around his body, the stench of charred flesh curling into the rafters. But there was no saving the others. The fire leapt like a living thing, drawn to every scrap of hemp, every smear of resin, finding easy fuel in the floor rushes, in the drapes, in the hair of women too slow to escape. People clawed their way to the doors, trampling those who stumbled, the pounding of feet and shrieks forming a single animal sound. The music had stopped, but its rhythm was replaced by the frantic hammering of fists on bolted panels, the crack of beams giving way overhead. In the chaos, a few men with cloaks tried to beat down the flames licking at the king's legs, others throwing their bodies over the burning dancers in a futile bid to smother them. The pitch seared skin on contact, making rescuers recoil in pain before they could do more than slap at the fire. The very materials that had given the costumes their eerie, wild appearance now turned them into death traps. The hemp phrase acted like wicks, drawing the fire deeper with each frantic movement. The hall had become a furnace, the air unbreathable, the smell unforgettable. Those who escaped into the courtyard gasped like drowning men, clutching one another, some with faces blistered, some with hair and eyebrows gone, all watching the doorway in horror, waiting to see who, if anyone, would emerge alive from the smoke. The air still carried the sickening tang of burnt pitch and scorched flesh when the last flames sputtered out. The great hall, once a glittering theater of masks and music, had been reduced to a din-choking cavern, its walls streaked with soot and its floors blackened with ash. The torches guttered, throwing weak, uneven light over twisted fragments of costume, fragments of linen stiffened with the black tar that had sealed their fate. And among it all, scattered like discarded effigies, lay the bodies of men who, only moments earlier, had danced before their king. The Comte de Juan had been found first, crumpled against one of the oak columns, as though he had been trying to pull himself up. his hand still clenched around a charred scrap of hemp. The pitch had burned deep into his skin, fusing the cloth to his flesh, and the heat had been so intense that his face was almost unrecognizable. He had been one of the most dashing courtiers at Charles VI's side, skilled in diplomacy, with a talent for reading the shifting currents of faction in Paris. Only a month before, he had been in earnest discussion about arranging a political marriage to strengthen the crown's ties with Burgundy. Now, his voice was stilled forever, and with it, a subtle but important thread of influence at court. Not far away lay Yvain de Foix. He had been pulled from the fire alive, but barely, his breaths ragged and shallow. His armor of tarred linen had trapped the heat against his body, searing his skin in seconds. Servants had tried to douse him with wine in desperation when no water could be found, but the liquid had only hissed and steamed uselessly against the flames. He had clung on for an hour after the blaze, murmuring the name of his homeland, the county of Foix, before the pain overtook him. Yvain had been more than just a knight. He was a link to the powerful Foix family in the south, a man whose loyalty was prized in the delicate balancing act between the Gascon lords and the French crown. His loss was not just personal, but strategic. Immersive de Poitiers was found near the musicians' gallery, his body twisted as though he had tried to crawl beneath the raised platform for shelter. The fire had caught him from behind, driving him forward, and the pitch had burned so fiercely that the wood of the platform had blackened where his back had pressed against it. Immersive had been a poet as much as a courtier, a man who entertained the salons of Paris with verses that blended courtly love with biting wit. His absence would be keenly felt in the king's circle, not for any great political maneuvering, but because his charm had often been the oil that smoothed over tensions in gatherings. In a court where words could wound as sharply as swords, Immersive's loss was a quieter, but no less significant blow. Then there was Hugues de Guisson. His death was perhaps the most greenly symbolic of all. Known for his sharp tongue and occasional arrogance, he had been one of the ringleaders in planning the masquerade. It was his idea to dress the dancers in pitch-smeared hemp to resemble wild men, a spectacle meant to shock and amuse the assembled guests. Eyewitnesses later claimed that in his final moments, Hugues had tried to tear the burning hem from his body, his hands blackening and curling as the tar ate through his skin. He had collapsed in the center of the hall, the very place where the dancers had begun their fateful performance, and some whispered that it was divine justice that he perished so swiftly. Whether or not one believed that, there was no denying the irony that the man whose ingenuity had birthed the spectacle had been consumed by it. The funerals came swiftly. In the days after the fire, the streets of Paris echoed with the tolling of bells, their slow, deliberate rhythm summoning the faithful to mourn. The coffins, closed to spare the mourners the sight of what the fire had done, were draped in black cloth and carried through the city under heavy guard. Each man's cortege was accompanied by the banners of his house, their bright colors a defiant splash against the winter gloom. The Comte de Juan's family came in sombre procession, their faces set in the rigid mask of noble grief. For Yvain de Foix, emissaries from the south bore his body homeward, the journey long and cold. Immersive de Poitiers was interred in Paris, his grave quickly becoming a place where poets and courtiers alike came to lay verses in his memory. Huguet de Guesson's funeral was the most hushed. While his friends wept, there were those who stood at a distance, lips pressed tight, thinking perhaps of the part he had played in the tragedy. The public reaction was immediate and raw. The fire was spoken of in every market and alleyway, the details growing with each telling, the screams, the smell, the sight of noblemen writhing like living torches. Some wept openly for the dead. Others muttered darkly about divine punishment, about pride and folly. The king himself, though shielded by the quick thinking of the Duchess of Berry, was said to be haunted by the sight of his companions engulfed in flame. Chroniclers recorded that his mood grew darker in the weeks that followed, a shadow settling over the court. What had been intended as a night of laughter and spectacle had instead left a scar, not just on the stone of the palace walls, but on the heart of the kingdom. By the time the ashes had been swept away and the hall restored to its former splendor, the memory of that night had already begun to harden into legend. But for those who had seen the faces of the dying, who had heard their voices falter into silence, it was no legend. It was a wound that would never fully heal. Scandal rolled through the court of France like a second fire. The smoke from the tragedy at the Bal des Ardents had barely cleared, yet already whispers curled through the great holes, across city streets, and into the parlors of Paris. What had happened that night was not simply a misfortune. To many it was a symptom of rot, decay in the royal household that no amount of mourning cloth could conceal. The official line was quick to take shape. Chroniclers friendly to the crown emphasized the accidental nature of the blaze. They painted the king as a victim of ill luck, not of his own reckless indulgence. Yet the reality was harder to smooth over. This had been a masquerade of wild men, flammable from head to toe, performed in a packed hall lit by open torches, hardly the sort of sober spectacle expected of a monarch already facing whispers about his mind and judgment. In the days that followed, one name emerged as a convenient receptacle for blame: Huguet de Guiset. Even before the ball, Guiset had been disliked by many at court. Sharp-tongued and arrogant, he was known for mocking others with a cruelty that spared neither rank nor gender. It was whispered that he had been the one to push for the more outrageous elements of the dance, costumes smeared with pitch, movements designed to provoke laughter rather than decorum. And when the flames erupted, he had done little to save himself or others, his shrieks of agony searing into the memories of those present. It was easy then to cast him as the villain. Some claimed that the whole performance had been his idea, that he had cajoled the others into participating. Others went further, muttering darkly that it was all part of some devilish prank gone wrong. There was no real evidence for such theories, but they didn't need proof. The people wanted a scapegoat, and Guiset, conveniently dead, could not defend himself. Behind closed doors, however, the scandal was less about Guiset and more about the king. Charles VI had not yet recovered fully from his earlier bouts of madness. His erratic behavior was still the subject of gossip, both within France and beyond its borders. For the monarch to appear at such a frivolous and dangerous event, to take part in it personally, was seen as a breach of dignity at best and a lapse of sanity at worst. Foreign envoys wrote home in guarded but telling language. Princes of the blood, though careful not to criticize openly, began to mutter among themselves about the king's judgment. For the Parisian public, the ball became an emblem of the disconnect between the rulers and the ruled. The winter of 1393 was harsh, grain prices high, and yet the court had been dancing in absurd, flammable costumes. The people freeze while the king plays at being a wild man, one anonymous pamphlet declared, a line repeated in taverns and marketplaces for weeks after. The Queen, Isabel of Bavaria, worked swiftly to contain the damage. She organized formal mourning for the dead nobles, arranging processions and masses intended to show both piety and contrition. The king himself made a public appearance to pray for the souls lost, his head bowed low, his hands clasped tightly. It was a staged act of humility, meant to soften the murmurs of dissent. But for many, the image of Charles laughing in a pitch-smeared costume just moments before disaster was harder to forget than any public prayer. The scandal had long shadows. Some courtiers distanced themselves from the king, wary of being tainted by association. Others saw opportunity. Weakness in the crown could be leveraged for influence. And though the bal des Ardents would fade from the front pages of Parisian gossip in time, it left behind an indelible stain on Charles' reign. To his detractors, it was proof that the king was not only unstable in mind, but reckless in conduct. A monarch whose own amusements could imperil his court, his kingdom, and himself. Fire was as constant a presence in the medieval world as wind or rain. It was essential for heats, lights, cooking, and industry. But it was also one of the greatest, most unpredictable threats to life and property. In the crowded towns of 14th century Europe, where buildings leaned close over narrow streets and roofs were often thatched, a single spark could change a community's fate overnight. The technology to control or contain the blaze was primitive, and the materials of daily life, wood, pitch, hemp, straw, were born to burn. In homes, open hearths were rarely left cold. They glowed in kitchens, workshops, and great halls, with no chimneys in many poorer dwellings to direct the smoke out. Sparks escaped easily into rafters or rush-covered floors. Candles made of tallow or beeswax dripped and guttered, their flames vulnerable to a stray sleeve or careless hand. Even lamps, which seemed safer, used oil that could flare up violently if knocked over. The list of medieval fire hazards extended far beyond domestic life. Blacksmith forges, glassworks, pottery kilns, and bakeries all relied on intense heat and open flame. Charcoal burners tended smoldering pits in nearby forests. Lime kilns roared in the countryside. Fire was the engine of production, but every workshop was a potential tinderbox. In rural settings, summer drought could turn fields and pastures into kindling, and an unattended bonfire might ignite a barn or haystack in seconds. The towns of northern France, Flanders, and England were particularly vulnerable due to dense timber construction. In some cities, local ordinances tried to limit the spread of fire. Thatch was banned in London after the Great Fire of 1212. Paris required certain masonry partitions between houses, but enforcement was inconsistent, and rebuilding after a fire often meant returning to the same risky designs. Medieval firefighting equipment was rudimentary. Leather buckets, ladders, wet blankets, and long poles to pull down burning sections of buildings. Human chains passed water from wells or rivers to the blaze, but the speed of a medieval fire often made such efforts desperate and futile. Historical records preserve the memory of many catastrophic blazes. In 1212, London suffered a fire so fierce it trapped thousands on London Bridge, some leaping into the Thames to escape, many drowning. In 1296, Florence's textile district went up in flames, causing economic chaos for months. Paris itself burned repeatedly. The fire of 1345 devastated entire districts along the Seine. Churches were not spared either. In 1370, lightning struck St. Paul's in London, igniting the timber roof and destroying much of the building. But fires also fascinated medieval people. Chroniclers often described them with a mix of horror and awe, likening them to divine punishment or the flames of hell. The imagery of burning, of destruction, cleansing, or purging sin, was deeply rooted in religious and cultural thought. Preachers could point to a city fire as a warning from God, urging repentance. In art and manuscript illumination, fire was painted in bright reds and golds, almost beautiful in its depiction, even as it represented chaos and loss. This mingling of fear and fascination explains why certain events, like the Bal des Arbantes, gripped the medieval imagination so powerfully. Fire was not only a hazard of life, it was a symbol, a sign, a force beyond human control. When it struck in the heart of the royal court, it was not simply an accident. To many, it was an omen. And in a world where the boundary between the earthly and the divine was thin, that omen could mean almost anything. Divine wrath, political doom, or the unraveling of the kingdom itself. In the weeks following the Ball of the Burning Men, the French court became a cauldron of intrigue. The disaster had not merely taken lives, it had left a scar on the monarchy's reputation, and those who thrived in political turbulence moved quickly to turn it to their advantage. What had begun as a moment of grotesque spectacle, whispered about in markets and taverns from Paris to Rouen, was soon weaponized in the factional struggles that already gripped the realm. The death toll included men from noble houses whose loyalty had been essential in maintaining fragile alliances. Their families, publicly mourning, were privately tallying the cost of their loss in influence, patronage, and land. Every empty seat at council, every widowed household, became an opening for rivals to press their claims. Into this atmosphere stepped those with the sharpest political instincts, ready to reshape the court's power structure in their favor. Foremost among those in the line of suspicion was Louis, Duke of Orléans, the king's younger brother. He had not been one of the dancers that night, but his proximity to the king and his role in organizing the entertainment drew immediate scrutiny. In an age when spectacle was power, to be the impresario of a disaster was dangerous. Orléans was already a divisive figure, accused by some of overreaching ambition, and whispered to be too intimate with Queen Isabeau. Now, in the eyes of many, he bore at least moral responsibility for the calamity. His enemies at court, particularly the Burgundian faction, moved quickly. They reminded anyone who would listen that the king's unstable mental state, already a matter of unease, had been aggravated by the trauma of the fire. It was argued that Louis's influence encouraged Charles's recklessness, distracting him from governance and pulling him deeper into costly, dangerous diversions. Chroniclers sympathetic to the Burgundians painted the ball not as an unfortunate accident, but as symptomatic of a corrupt and frivolous inner circle. Pamphlets and letters, copied and carried by messengers across France, whispered of the king's negligence. They lingered on lurid details, the screams, the smell of burning flesh, the chaos of the hall. In retellings, the fact that the king had been saved by a teenage duchess was recast as a humiliation, proof that he could not even protect himself, let alone his realm. It was not merely the fire's heat that threatened Charles's reign, but the cold embers of public shame. Louis d'Orléans, sensing the danger, worked to shield himself. He emphasized his loyalty to his brother, arranging for masses in memory of the dead and making conspicuous donations to their families. He also turned to his own network of clients and allies, reinforcing their positions in local governance, ensuring that gratitude and obligation might insulate him against further accusations. Yet for all his maneuvering, the incident deepened the rift between his supporters and those of the powerful Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold. The Burgundians framed the disaster as a divine warning, a judgment against the moral laxity of the royal household. This was more than pious rhetoric, it was a potent political weapon. In a realm where God's will was seen in every harvest and every defeat, the implication that heaven had set fire to the king's companions could not be easily dismissed. The more this view took hold, the more it threatened not only the king's personal prestige, but also the legitimacy of his rule. In council, calls for reform were voiced more openly. Some demanded stricter court protocol, greater oversight of royal entertainments, and limits on spending. Others hinted that governance should be placed more firmly in the hands of the king's uncles and experienced counselors until Charles was better able, physically and mentally, to discharge his duties. Behind the polite language of counsel lay the sharper intent of curbing both the king and the influence of his brother. By the end of the year, the court had split into more clearly defined camps. The fire had not caused the fissures, but it had widened them, providing fresh evidence for those who saw Charles as unfit and Louis as dangerously ambitious. In the chessboard politics of the Valois court, every death in the fire was a piece removed, every accusation a calculated move. The ball of the burning men was thus more than a tragedy. It became a turning point in the ongoing struggle for dominance between the Orleanist and Burgundian factions. For some, it was the night the king's reputation began to truly crumble. For others, it was the spark that lit the long, smoldering feud that would help lead France into deeper civil strife. The flames in the Hôtel Saint-Paul had died within hours, but their political blow lingered, casting long shadows over the reign of Charles VI. In the years following the tragedy, the Bal des Ardents became one of the most frequently recounted scandals of the French court. Chroniclers such as Jean Froissart and the anonymous monk of Saint-Denis gave vivid accounts, each shaping the event according to their political sympathies. Some painted it as a moment of pure misfortune, an accident born of youthful folly. Others presented it as a divine judgment on a decadent and irresponsible nobility. Every version agreed on one thing: the image of the King of France, dressed as a wild man, nearly burned alive before the eyes of his court, was unforgettable. In popular memory, the fire came to symbolize the fragility of royal power. The medieval imagination thrived on omens, and many interpreted the flames as a warning from God about the state of the realm. The people of Paris, already wary of the king's bouts of madness, whispered that the blaze proved heaven's displeasure. For years afterward, the story was told in taverns and marketplaces, often with exaggerated detail. Flames reaching the ceiling in an instant, screams heard across the Seine, the king's hair singed to the scalp. Truth and embellishment blurred, as they so often did in an age without printed newspapers. Artists and poets drew inspiration from the disaster. Illuminated manuscripts depicted the ballroom scene, with figures in grotesque, shaggy costumes engulfed in stylized red and gold flames. A few painters rendered the Duchess de Berry as a saint-like figure, her skirts spread wide to shield the king. A rare moment in medieval art where a young noblewoman was the clear heroine. Minstrels and poets composed verses that mixed courtly romance with grim morality play, warning that no amount of splendor could shield one from death's sudden arrival. The Bal des Ardents also entered political propaganda. Those hostile to the king's brother, the Duc d'Orléans, used the story to portray him as reckless, claiming his faction encouraged dangerous amusements and squandered France's dignity. For opponents of the king's uncles in the Burgundian faction, the fire was proof of the court's need for fresh leadership and new priorities. In both cases, the actual victims became secondary to the political narratives built upon their deaths. By the late 15th century, the story had hardened into legend. It was retold in chronicles, sermons, and even early printed histories as an example of the Mad King era. The event came to stand for the dangers of unchecked festivity, the unpredictable reach of fire, and the ever-present shadow of divine retribution in medieval thought. Centuries later, historians still find in the Bal des Ardents an almost theatrical encapsulation of the late medieval French court. Its splendor, its dangers, its political intrigues, and its taste for spectacle that could, in a single moment, turn to catastrophe. The fire may have burned for only minutes, but its embers glowed in France's cultural memory for generations. The Bal des Ardents did something that court sermons and foreign ambassadors had never quite managed. It made the nobility sit up and look at the dangers of their own amusements. For a few months after the fire, pageantry at the Hôtel Saint-Paul and at other royal residences acquired an edge of sobriety, not because princes suddenly loved thrift or prudence, but because watching your friends turn into torches has a way of changing a person's appetite for risk. The immediate instinct was to tone things down. The longer one was to tinker with spectacle. The more cautious one became about how much flame one invited to dinner. The most noticeable change was practical and pedestrian. The king stopped throwing himself bodily into the most hazardous stunts. Charles VI, who had once been fond of appearing in person for the wildest bits of court entertainment, took a step back from the physically dangerous elements of performance. Where he had previously leapt into masquerades and close-quarters revelry, he began to favor appearances that allowed him to be seen rather than to prance. Whether this reflected trauma, political advice, or the steady worsening of his condition, it mattered. The sight of a monarch content to be an ornament rather than a participant was, for the courtiers, a small but emphatic concession to common sense. Costume makers, too, learned a little humility. For a short while, craftsmen abandoned the most obviously combustible approaches, pitch-soaked hemp and the flammable accoutrements that made for a striking silhouette, not by royal decree so much as by shame and prudence. Tailors and artisans were urged to devise alternatives that gave the same fantastical impression without turning wearers into living beacons. Where once the easiest way to simulate shaggy hair was to mat fibers and seal them with resin, workshops experimented with layered cloth, gilded leather, and stiffened fabrics that would hold shape without feeding a torch. Whether these innovations lasted is another matter. Fashion and spectacle have a short memory, but for a time at least, there was less literal tender on display. Safety measures that survived the initial shock were rarely the product of enlightened regulation. They were improvisations born of panic. More water was placed in the hulls before large gatherings, not as a formal regulation, but as a matter of habit. Servants were instructed in hushed and urgent tones to keep barrels and buckets nearer to where the audience gathered. Musicians and stagehands were told, with varying degrees of sincerity, to keep their wicks and braziers away from processional routes. The Queen's household insisted on extra attendants to watch the floor and clear escape routes, an innovation that reads as common sense now, but was then a modest administrative improvement. In short, buckets and a few extra servants were the medieval equivalent of "please use the exits." There was also a moral and rhetorical shift. Sermons and chronicles leaned on the spectacle as evidence of courtly excess. Preachers used the episode to warn against pride and the vanity of feasts. The bal des ardents became shorthand for ruinous indulgence in moralizing pamphlets and whispered conversation. That rhetorical usage had a practical effect. Nobles who paid heed to the currents of reputation found that ostentatious and dangerously literal entertainment now carried a reputational cost. People still loved splendor, but the connection between access and public censure tightened for a few seasons. Yet restraint was never total. Court culture is a hungry thing, and the appetite for novelty returned, as it always does. Within a few years, the Valois court was again hosting elaborate feasts and spectacles, but in slightly different forms. Dangerous amusements did not disappear, they mutated. Jousts continued to provide their own time-honored hazards, and hunt injuries remained a regular feature of noble life. The difference was that increasingly spectacles sought to be elaborate without being obviously incendiary. Mechanical devices, theatrical sets, theatrical maquettes and cages for exotic animals, elaborate tableaux that relied on stagecraft rather than raw flammability. Those entertainments carried their own risks. Animals bite, scaffolds collapse, machines fail. But they offered a way to surprise a court without necessarily setting someone alight. Even so, the Hôtel St. Paul itself never quite shrugged off the memory. For years, the palace hosted its dances with a nervous undercurrent. Hosts would check the placement of torches as if making sure no one had hidden a loose candle in a sleeve. Any new amusement that recalled the wild men, hairy masks, dramatic bindings, chained processions, was eyed with suspicion. Invitations were read more carefully. Guests made mental notes of where the nearest water supply lay. The young and reckless still tried ideas, of course. Youth is resilient in its appetite for spectacle, but the older generation had a sharpened sense of when to say no. There were, of course, other strange and dangerous events at the French court in later years: jousting accidents that cost lives, hunts that ended in broken limbs or worse, and occasional stage mishaps where an ill-timed firework or mechanical failure injured performers or onlookers. These incidents were met with the same flurry of gossip and the same brief moment of contrition. The rhythm never really changed: a calamity, a flurry of safety improvisations and sermons, then a return to appetite. Still, the Bal des Ardents kept its place in the court's collective memory as a particularly grotesque example of how quickly merriment could curdle into catastrophe. In the end, the most lasting adjustment was psychological. The court learned that spectacle carried risk and that some spectacles were beneath the crown. That realization did not abolish pageantry. Royalty is, after all, fundamentally in the business of being watched, but it put a slightly more wary hand on the tiller. The flames at the Hotel St. Paul had done more than kill 4 men and singe the king's hair. They introduced a caution into the choreography of power. The courtiers retained their taste for the theatrical, but for a time they dared it with one eye on beauty and the other on where the nearest bucket of water might sit. In the centuries since the Bal des Ardents, historians have often compared it to other royal or elite disasters that combined hubris, spectacle, and tragedy. The fire in the Hotel St. Paul in 1393 was not unique in its horror, but it stood out for its theatrical absurdity. Nobles dressed as wild men in flammable pitch and hemp costumes, dancing at a masquerade while the king himself joined in. This blending of festivity and fatality has parallels across time and geography, each echoing the same themes: elite overconfidence, the lure of spectacle, and the devastating consequences when danger is ignored. One of the most obvious comparisons is to the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, not for loss of life, but for its sheer display of royal excess. That Anglo-French meeting between Henry VIII and Francis I showcased immense pageantry, temporary palaces, and dangerous tournaments where accidents could and did happen. While it lacked the deadly fire of 1393, the spirit was the same. Rulers eager to outshine each other, even at the risk of injury or scandal. The Bal des Ardents was a more tragic version of that impulse, its recklessness ending in charred bodies rather than diplomatic bragging rights. More deadly comparisons come from events like the fire at the Vienna Ring Theatre in 1881, which killed over 380 people when stage decorations and gaslighting turned the building into a furnace. Though centuries apart, both disasters were intensified by materials and staging choices made without thought for safety. In the Bal des Ardents, it was pitch-soaked costumes. In Vienna, it was flammable scenery and gas lamps. But in both cases, the audience and participants underestimated the danger because they were wrapped in the illusion of art and performance. Even outside Europe, parallels can be drawn. In Edo period Japan, fires were so common in the tightly packed wooden cities that they were nicknamed Flowers of Edo. Several great conflagrations were sparked by celebrations or ritual events where caution was abandoned in the name of tradition. In 1657, the Great Fire of Mairiki began during a ceremonial event and destroyed most of Edo, killing over 100,000 people. Though the scale dwarfs that of 1393, the root cause, a gathering meant to inspire awe, turning into a mass tragedy, remains eerily similar. In more modern royal contexts, one could compare the Bal des Ardents to the 1981 fire at the royal wedding celebrations of the King of Bhutan, when a canopy collapse and subsequent blaze killed dozens. The parallels lie not only in the setting, a royal festivity gone wrong, but in the political fallout. In both cases, questions were raised about the competence and judgment of those at the top, as well as the failure of courtiers to speak up against dangerous plans. What all these disasters share is a collision of spectacle and risk. Royal courts, by their nature, sought to astonish, whether through architecture, costumes, or dangerous games. This desire to impress, combined with a sense of untouchability, created conditions where safety was an afterthought. In the Bal des Ardentes, the belief that the king's presence guaranteed control over events proved fatally misguided. In later centuries, similar overconfidence would doom others. The Bal des Ardentes also lives on in the way it shaped the cautionary tales of history. Chroniclers and moralists used it as a symbol of courtly excess, an example of what happens when the powerful indulge their whims without restraint. By comparing it to other royal disasters, we see a pattern repeated, the thin line between celebration and catastrophe, and the way history remembers those moments, not for the splendor they intended, but for the ruin they caused. The Bal des Ardentes is often remembered for its spectacle and its horror, but beneath the chronicles and the symbolism lies something more elemental, the human traits that set the stage for it. Every actor in this drama was shaped by a combination of personal ambition, cultural norms, and the psychological atmosphere of the late 14th century. Understanding them requires stepping past the lists of names and titles and into the frailties, impulses, and desires that turned a courtly celebration into a catastrophe. At the center was King Charles VI, a man torn between two realities, the ceremonial figurehead of French monarchy and the troubled individual plagued by bouts of mental illness. His decision to participate in the dance disguised as a wild man was not just a moment of whimsy. It was an act rooted in the courtly culture that prized theatricality, disguise, and spectacle as much as it did politics and war. Yet Charles's trust in those around him, his lack of awareness about the risk, and his inability to anticipate disaster reflected a vulnerability that his enemies would later exploit. The other dancers, Yvain de Foix, Amary Potier, the Comte de Joigny, and Huguet de Gizet, were not reckless fools, but products of a court where entertainment was a competitive display of status. To be seen participating in a daring, elaborate performance alongside the king was not only a mark of favor, but a signal of closeness to power. Their costumes, flammable and impractical, were symbols of the extravagant creativity of the French court, but also of its blindness to danger when prestige and amusement were at stake. Huguet de Gizet in particular stood out for his reputation. Chroniclers describe him as quarrelsome, sharp-tongued, and fond of mocking others. Some accused him of masterminding or encouraging the dance, though whether this was true or a convenient political scapegoating remains unclear. What is certain is that his personality, provocative and theatrical, made him an easy target in the search for someone to blame. Beyond individual character flaws, the Bal des Ardentes was shaped by the environment of the late medieval royal court, a setting where spectacle was currency, where boundaries between ceremony and danger were often blurred, and where safety was rarely prioritized over the thrill of performance. There was an inherent belief that the court, as the pinnacle of civilization, could control risk through rank, privilege, and divine favor. That illusion would die in the flames of January 1393. The human side of the story is not just about the guilty or the foolish. It is about the deeply ingrained impulses, pride, the desire to impress, the thrill of novelty that drive people in every age to flirt with danger in the name of glory or belonging. The Bal des Ardents reminds us that history's disasters are rarely the product of one man's folly. They are the outcome of shared assumptions, cultural pressures, and the universal human tendency to believe that tragedy happens to other people. In this sense, the fire of 1393 still burns in the psychology of risk today, echoing through every age where pride and performance outweigh caution. The Bal des Ardents was already a cautionary tale, but imagining how events might have unfolded had the king perished gives the story a sharper edge. Charles VI was the center of a fragile political balance. His mental illness had already left governance in the hands of competing factions, the Armagnacs, loyal to his queen Isabeau of Bavaria and her allies, and the Burgundians, led by his ambitious uncle, Philip the Bold, and later his son, John the Fearless. If the king had died that winter night in 1393, the throne would have passed immediately to his son the Dauphin, a child of just 4 years old. This would have meant a regency, and in medieval France, regencies rarely meant stability. Philip the Bold would have almost certainly asserted himself as regent, using the opportunity to sideline the queen and cement Burgundian influence over France. Isabeau, fiercely protective of her children and her own power, would have fought to retain her position, perhaps calling on her Bavarian family's support or aligning with other French lords to counter the Burgundian threat. Civil war might have ignited years earlier than it did historically, splitting the kingdom long before the pressures of the 100 Years' War demanded unity. The English, under Richard II and then Henry IV, could have exploited the chaos, making French internal collapse as much a factor in their campaigns as any battlefield victories. Culturally, the death of Charles VI at a courtly entertainment, especially in such a grotesque and preventable manner, would have cast a long, dark shadow over French court life. The Bal des Ardents would have been transformed from a grim curiosity into a national trauma, a constant reminder of the dangers of frivolity at the highest levels of power. Lavish masks and spectacles might have been curtailed drastically, either by outright bans or through the informal pressure of a nobility unwilling to be seen engaging in dangerous pageantry while the memory of a king's burning lingered. The symbolism would have been potent, a monarch destroyed by fire while playing at being a wild man, a metaphor for rulers consumed by their own folly. But history turned on the narrow margin between life and death that night. Charles VI survived, his reign continued, and the Bal des Ardents remained a grotesque footnote rather than the central catastrophe it might have been. But, in its near miss, it offered a glimpse of how fragile monarchy could be, and how easily the course of a nation could change because of a single night's folly.